And before we get going, here's a word about our sponsors. SDHQ Motorsports is a powerhouse 30,000 square foot facility with 45 family members reporting for duty. This single owner, single location business is based out of Gilbert, Arizona. It can handle anything from a hot rod, daily driver, pre-runner, race vehicle, half-track or Kugelwagen, or just about any other project you need help with. Their skilled staff with hundreds of years of combined experience eats, sleeps, and breathes performance. So go check them out at sdhqmotorsports.com or check them out on Insta at sdhqmotorsports. The We Happy Few 506 podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Gettysburg Museum of History, home of the Major Dick Winters collection and the largest assortment of authentic Band of Brothers artifacts in the world. Visit the free museum at 219 Baltimore Street in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, or at www.gettysburgmuseumofhistory.com, and on the YouTube channel, The History Underground, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.
We few, we happy few, we band of brothers.
Well, hello, and welcome along to another We Happy Few 506 podcast, The Nearly Men, on this Memorial Day, if you're in the USA. There's some great posts going out there. Thanks, everybody, for that. And it's just me, but that's fine, because I've got a lot to get through with our guest, our returning guest, friend of the show, buccaneering rugby player, SAS chronicler and enthusiast, Gavin Mortimer. How you doing, buddy?
Yeah, very well. How are you?
Yeah, not bad. I got something funny to tell you, actually. So we we were talking the last time we were on about sort of the sense of humour that gets sort of British forces through all the campaigns and the muck-ups and everything that they get involved in down the centuries. Well, I've been out in the States for a couple of weeks. I was in Gettysburg doing a thing for a film festival there, and then I went up to Boston, which that was it was a huge bike ride, a bit like Rolling Thunder that they have in DC, where all these like bikers and Hells Angels and all these gangs they ride through Boston. There's like 3,000 of them ride through Boston for wounded vets. And specifically in this case, it was, I believe, tell me if I'm wrong here, Leighton, but it was the evac of Kabul Airport.
All right, yeah.
And I think the ball bearing bomb went off and maimed people. Horrendous. So they were honoring some of the vets for that, and they'd raised a bunch of money. And there was one guy, I just get his name right, Hartswick. I have to get his name right because I'm pretty sure he's listening now, who was a medic. And he, something had gone off and a bunch of his guys were down, and he'd gone out to rescue some of these Marines, and he'd gotten blown up himself. So he was a double amputee, lost both his legs. And we met on the Friday night when I first got to Boston, and then there was a Band of Brothers kind of panel Saturday. So we did all this stuff. And he, like a lot of these vets, quite quiet and humble with a super pretty wife. They've always got like a really super pretty wife. Smug. He might have just been smug, not humble. I don't know. But he was quite quiet and everything. And then I don't know whether by the Saturday night he'd gotten a couple of drinks in him or something. I don't know. But we were walking out of this. It was in a casino in Boston. We're walking out of this casino in Boston, and we're all suited and everything. And he wheels himself up next to me, alongside me, looks up to me and goes, "You know my dick still works, right?" And then just wheels off. And I was like, and then he wheels back and goes, "I know you were thinking it." It's just such a, like, not often am I lost for words. I was like, that was a drop. I was like, yeah, you got me, man. You got me totally. That was brilliant. It was they were such brilliant guys. Everybody there.
I mean, one of the books I wrote about 11 years ago was Merrill's Marauders, a history of Merrill's Marauders, the American Special Forces unit. And I was fortunate enough to interview about 15 of the Marauders, and obviously I did a lot of research, and I think there too, and I think this, it's that sort of humor, that sort of self-deprecating, macabre humor is prevalent throughout most of special forces units, particularly I think that we touched on last time. Sort of the Anglophone world too, American, Australian, Canadian, and obviously the British. And so I think it is such an important, a small but very significant part of their psychological makeup, because a lot of the time they're operating under great stress. humor, I think, is a way of sort of just turning the release valve a little bit and easing some of that stress out of the situation.
Yeah, and then of course dealing with life afterwards as well.
Yeah,
Yeah, as I believe your man there, he does a lot of lecturing on, just basically coping with life afterwards in lots of different sort of like stressful situations that people have got themselves in, and how to deal with things. And
mm,
I don't know, he just seems very sort of kind of zen. Do you know what I mean?
yeah,
But
yeah,
root of that is this sort of macabre sense of humor, as you said.
yeah. I think it's wonderful. The charities, the Invictus and all these other um, very important organizations that in the last 20 years since Iraq and Afghanistan on both sides of the Atlantic and in Australia have sprung up, and they give a very important sense of purpose, of continuation that wasn't there after the First and the Second World War. And I always find it very sad to read stories of in the 1920s, these um, legless First World War veterans, armless First World War, selling matches outside train stations, etc. And um, it's they were just, they were just, thanks very much, boys. There you go. But no, barely a livable pension, no form of psychological um, rehabilitation. And 100 years on, we as a society have moved on. Thankfully, it's to such a great degree in respecting and honoring, and more importantly, giving a sort of giving a sense of, yeah, identity and pride back, and to veterans who've given so much for us.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, like, yeah, you can't send these young boys off to war and then sort of be like, "Ooh, that's a bit yucky. You've lost two
Yeah.
arms." Ever, you know
Mm.
what I mean? I think people like Andy Biggio, who is organised this event in Boston. I mean, he's sometimes you need these type of characters to do this. He's an absolute scoundrel,
Mm.
absolute scoundrel in real life, but he's just got this like huge heart of gold, and thousands of people come out, and all these like crazy bikers and stuff, and just like they just support these guys. It is truly amazing.
Yeah.
It's really cool that they do it. It's amazing to be part of it and race around Boston in the back of a police
Yeah.
with the siren going. It was incredible. Anyway, I'll get you into your more specific field of expertise. We talked the last time you came on. We bounced around a lot of SAS stuff and Paddy Mayne and all that sort of stuff that's in the public consciousness now because of TV shows and books like yours and everything. But I wonder if we couldn't go back to the origin story. We said we were going to do it when you came back on, and talk about the long range desert group in a bit more detail. You could
Yeah.
do that. Um, I mean, I wrote this down, but I don't want to say it unless it's true. But would you agree that if it wasn't for the long range desert group, the SAS, at least in the desert, would have died in its infancy?
Yes, without a doubt. Um, and um, and they acknowledge this too. There was a memorial. The SAS Regimental Association has looked after. There was a. I've got here actually.
Yeah,
This is the first ever um, newsletter of the Long Range Desert Group Association. So a bit of a, should take it onto Antiques Roadshow and get it valued. So it was that's the second one. So the first one, which more or less is newsletter number one, Italy, the 14th of July, 1945. It's that. So it's a page and a quarter. And then if I got here too, this is how it's evolved. This is 1969, a good magazine, 46 pages, just wonderful for an historian, because what it has is a lot of anecdotes, memoirs, letters from veterans, um, which is recounting anecdotes or important events from the war. And actually, just touching on what we were saying there, it was also a good way for the long range desert group veterans to stay in touch with one another, because of
right.
course they were Kiwis, Rhodesians, and Brits, and so spread all over the world. So it was a good way of a lot of letters you find just saying, "Oh, I've changed address. Please write to me here. If you're ever in New Zealand or wherever it may be, swing by. I'd love to catch up, etc." So so that was yeah, that was the long range desert group were so. The association closed in 2000. That was their last reunion. The magazine stopped at their last reunion. The Queen sent a personal message saying um, how much respect she had for their skill and their expertise, and what they represented during the war would never be forgotten, and which was a lovely way to bring down the curtain. And then after that, it had been agreed that the SAS, because of course the Long Range Desert Group, their lifespan was 1940 to 1945, and although very much their ethos was incorporated into the SAS when it was reformed as a regular regiment 22 SAS in 1952. The LRDG as an entity ceased to be, and so the SAS Regimental Association, which does a wonderful job of looking after the welfare of former soldiers, former members, um, that took over the running of the Long Range Desert Group Association. And in 2014, up in Scotland, near the statue to David Stirling, there was a memorial unveiled with the LRDG Scorpion badge, and underneath they showed the way. So the SAS recognised that without the LRGG, they wouldn't be around today, and we can go into that in more detail if you like, but it was very much the Long Range Desert Group were the pioneers of British Special Forces in World War II.
Excellent. And so I guess that will lead us on to the formation of the group, which like we'll talk about the whens and the wheres, and they were the brainchild, I believe, of a man called Bagnold. Am I correct there?
You are Ralph Bagnold, famous family. His sister Enid was
Yeah.
one of the best known novelists of the interwar years and wrote National Velvet, which was made into that was the film that made Elizabeth Taylor about the young jockey.
Yes.
And
Ah,
that was Enid Bagnold. And I think The Secret Garden she wrote too, which is a huge. Anyway, she was a real star, and it's quite funny now because her books, like a lot of novelists, we know that they were of their time, and she's sort of gone out of fashion now. And she overshadowed her brother Ralph. Um, During their lifetimes, really. Um, and but of course now Ralph Bagnold, I mean, I've done my bit, and there's other good. Brendan O'Carroll in New Zealand has written with great knowledge about particularly about the New Zealand Long Range Desert Group. But the name Bagnold, he's also he was a scientist. He wrote this book, the physics of sand and the blown sand, I think. Anyway, it was about the desert terrain, and in fact, that was used by NASA in the 1960s because there was a similarity between the moon terrain and the desert terrain. And so they lent in. He went to NASA to lecture about his knowledge of the Western Desert, etc. So he yeah, a pretty impressive family, but it was Ralph Bagnold, who was a First World War veteran, born 1896 in the southwest of England, served in the trenches in the Royal Engineers on the Somme in the Western Front, survived the war, went back to Kenya. He was born. He was 19 when war broke out. So after the war, he went to university to Cambridge. Um, then after that, he returned to the army, joined the Royal Signals, was sent to Egypt in the mid 1920s, and fell in love with the desert. And he led, I think his first expedition was in 1925. I mean, for the next 7 years, he led these growing expeditions into the heart of the Libyan desert in Model T Fords, and with a group of like-minded, intrepid, mainly army officers, but one or two civilians, and just really um, opening up to Europeans the Western Desert. It had never before been mapped and penetrated to any great depth. He went to Siwa Oasis, which is about 400 miles west of Cairo. Alexander the Great had marched there and lost a lot of his men. And of course, it was also, though, at a time, particularly, I think his last expedition was in 1932. So he was able to see in that time the Italians beginning to build up their own um, military strength in
Yeah.
Libya. And he, in fact, lunched with an Italian military delegation in the desert during one of his expeditions in 1932. And the Italian joked, well, he said half jokingly, it would be pretty easy for us to seize Egypt, just to march into Egypt, seize the Suez Canal, etc. And Bagnall never forgot that. He left the army in 1935. War broke out in 1939, and he was called back to the colours. But in that great British way, here you've got the leading expert on North African desert, which is clearly going to be a theatre, a scene of conflict. So you've got the greatest European expert. Where do you send him? Let's send him to Kenya, East Africa. Luckily, as his troop ship was in a collision with another ship in the Mediterranean, so they stopped to Egypt for repairs. Bagnall took the opportunity to go into Cairo, introduce himself to some of his old military contacts, and say, "Listen, can you get me posted here? I think I'd be more used to the British Army." That happened, and he then quickly appraised the situation, saw the danger of the Italians. They had about 100,000 men now in Libya, and it was at the third time of asking in June 1940, shortly after Italy had declared war on Britain, that he went to General Wavell, the Commander-in-Chief Middle East, and said, "Listen, I can use me. My knowledge of the desert is unparalleled. What I propose is a reconnaissance force to go deep behind enemy lines, to come round the back of the Italians were mainly along the coast, but they had some sort of these sort of Beau Geste forts in the middle of nowhere, but just report back and gather intelligence so that we know more about their troop dispositions and whether they are planning to march in Egypt." So Wavell, very importantly, Wavell was a friend of T.E. Lawrence of Arabia in the First World War. And Wavell, despite being very much of that First World War Victorian generation, was a very innovative and um, uh, open-minded, I suppose, and just far-sighted officer who was saw that the rapid advances in the interwar years of communications, transport, weapons made this sort of guerrilla warfare the potential for being far more effective. So Lawrence of Arabia went about on horseback, and he was limited in what he could do. He was very much he corresponded with Bagnall, but incidentally in the 1920s, and was really the inspiration for a whole generation of British schoolboys who, when the Seven Pillars of Wisdom, his seminal book was published in 1926. It was required reading sort of for all teenage boys who loved adventure, and so he was absolutely a hero, and the number of particularly LRDG veterans that I met or whose memoirs, diaries I read, and they referenced T.E. Lawrence, and so that's how really the Long Range Desert Group came into being in June 1940, over a year before the formation of the SAS.
And from some of your research and your writings, like who were the sort of, I mean, obviously other than Bagnall, who were the sort of like foremost characters that come to the surface straight away and how were they recruited?
Um, he recruited Bagnold, of course, by this time was 44. And most of the officers he recruited were explorers he'd known from the 20s and 30s. So Pat Clayton, Guy Prendergast, who replaced Bagnold as CO in the summer of 41, Teddy Mitford, um, Bill Kennedy Shaw, who was a brilliant navigator and was the LRDG intelligence officer. Um, so they were and again, they were all middle-aged men. And most of them had left the army. And so Bagnold had 6 weeks. Wavell gave him 6 weeks to get this unit up and running. And at first, so he had his officers, and he also had some good contacts within in Cairo still. To Douglas Newbold was one who were able to acquire Chevrolet trucks and a lot of the uh, sand channels. He'd come up with several innovations during his desert travels in the interwar years. Sand channels were one. So these were corrugated iron, about 5 feet long and a foot wide, and you'd place them in front of the rear wheels, and they would help the vehicle then get out of if it was trapped in the sand. He also invented the sun compass because a magnetic compass was notoriously unreliable in traveling in the desert because of all the metal in the car. And the sun compass was sort of a bit like a sundial that you navigated with using the sun. A water condenser, which was to attached a cylinder attached to the outside of their vehicles, which would collect the water from the radiator. Let me get this. I'll just hold on. I've wrote this down because I'm not scientific minded, and it was so it just shows you uh, how innovative he was. So the water condenser, um, he placed a pipe on top of the vents on top of the radiator, which collected all the steam and directed it to an external container where it condensed back to water. As the engine cooled, pressure in the radiator would drop and the water from the external container would be sucked back into the cooling system. So that was a wonderful way, in the desert where water is at a premium. And so he was just he wasn't a warrior. I doubt, no, he never fired a shot in anger himself in World War II, Bagnold. But uh, he was able to, he was a very good judge of character, so he recruited very well, which brings us on to the next question about recruitment. He had his officers. Now for the men, his first choice were Australians because he believed that they possessed the sort of the independence of thought, the ruggedness, the intrepidness, the hardiness to because obviously he knew what was required of desert exploration. But he went to Thomas Blamey, who was in the commander of the Australian Corps, and Blamey said, "Well, I'm sorry, I'm under strict instructions from my government not to allow any of my men to be siphoned off by the British." This was probably I think a result of a consequence of Gallipoli in the First World War when there was still, understandably, the Australian top brass and the politicians didn't trust the British top brass. So then, having been rejected by the Australians, he went to the New Zealanders and he got the men that he wanted, and they proved brilliant. A mix of European descent, of Maoris, just tough men, a lot from who worked on farms, and were just good with their hands. So they were blue collar workers, I suppose. Um, After that was July 1940. So there you had the New Zealand patrol. Then you had the Rhodesian patrol because Bagnold said, yeah, Rhodesians, they're going to have similar qualities. And then in the end of 40, when the Long Range Desert Group it was initially the Long Range Patrol, and then in November 1940, such was their success, it was expanded to about 270 ranks and officers and men. And he raised the Guards Patrol because he believed that men, predominantly Scots Guards and Coldstream Guards, that they possessed the self-discipline to be good long-range desert group men. And then in beginning of 1941, the last patrol was Y Patrol, Yeomanry Patrol. So that was the second British patrol. And he believed that the Yeomanry regiments, you had a more, just a sort of individualists, I suppose, as they used to say at the time, men who were able to work individually and as part of a team, and had army discipline, but self-discipline, and perhaps most importantly, were able to broad-minded, I suppose. There were a few of the Guards recruits who didn't say the Guards also, there was a heavy recruitment of Guardsmen into the SBS and the SAS. And most adapted pretty well. There were a minority who just couldn't think because of a discipline in the Guards,
Yeah.
when told to show initiative, couldn't do it. But they were the minority. On the whole, they adapted very well and they thrived. They liked actually the chance to show some initiative, and to be given a sense of responsibility, and that was underpinned by the iron discipline instilled in them by the Guards. So it worked very well indeed. And there were very few RTUs, return to units, in the Long Range Desert Group. There were a few more in the SAS, but I think because Bagnold, being middle-aged, he was a completely different character, incidentally, to David Stirling, who was quite an extrovert and could be quite overbearing. Bagnold had a stutter throughout his life, which made him self-conscious and a little bit shy, but he was a very shrewd man. And because obviously being 44, 20 years older than David Stirling, he was just a better judge of character.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting because like I made a note. I don't want to get off topic here because I know we will, but like it seems to me that the recruitment process, particularly with the New Zealanders, where they have these rugged guys that come in, it just seems to me that they would also do very well in Test match rugby union as well.
Yeah, yeah.
But let's not get off topic. So they get these guys together. Now, is there a necessity to sort of like, I don't know, reboot them and retrain them? Or has their previous training, is that going to serve them well enough? And they think, well, these guys they have initiative, they have balls, they've got courage, they can think for themselves. You're already trained boys, just go out and do what we're telling you to do.
No, there was actually. That's a good question, but that in the SAS there was less of that because they were very much the SAS nicknamed the Long Range Desert Group the Long Range Taxi Service, and in turn the Long Range Desert Group nicknamed the SAS the Parachutes, and so but there was a respect among the LRDG veterans I met. They respected the courage and the boldness and the audacity of the SAS, but they did find them lacking, a little bit lazy, which of course was more down to the officers, David Stirling, in learning how to live in the desert, how to harness the desert. So the LRDG veterans were given a crash course in desert driving, how to drive in the desert, the different sorts of surfaces, because we think of a desert as, big rolling dunes like you get at the seaside. There is a lot of flat, hard packed surface, very good for driving on. You've got the Great Sand Sea, which is roughly the size of Ireland, where in some cases from the trough to the crest of a sand dune was 500 feet. And the SAS would, to surmount one of those, it was called a flying fuck. So you had to accelerate up it, keeping the wheels very straight, and then just decelerate just as you got to the top. And then you just let yourself fall over, topple over the edge. And then you just sort of slid down like skiing. And of course, the trick was just to keep the wheels dead straight, and not to panic more than anything. That's what they said. That's what Bagnold said. It was just getting used to these different sensations. And water conservation was crucial. The water discipline was something that Bagnold was fanatical about. He taught them how to have a sand bath. So something I think that T.E. Lawrence, perhaps what the greatest influence of T.E. Lawrence on the LRDG was he imparted to them how best to use the desert, not to be afraid of it, to respect it. And he Bagnold learned this in the 1920s, and he would some of the veterans remember telling me of their bafflement at seeing Bagnold taking a sand bath. So, but sand's very good for that dry, clean sand, just for getting out all the dirt. And he also live it. The Italians had brutalized the Zanussi, who were the indigenous people of the Libyan desert, and the Zanussi had actually fought against the British in World War One, but in World War Two, thanks really, I think, in part to Ralph Bagnold, who had a great respect for them, and uh, they were sort of they he won them over by giving them tea, medicine in some cases. The I remember one LRDG veteran, Lofty, telling me that he got separated from his LRDG patrol, which was December 41, and he luckily he came across a nomadic Zanussi tribe who took him in, and for 10 days he had dysentery. He caught dysentery on day two. Looked after him. The Germans were around. One time, a German patrol came close to the village, but they sheltered him. But they had a medicine box that had been given to them by the Italians, and they gave it to Lofty, to thinking that he might know as a European what it was. And when he looked inside, it was shoe polish, and the Italians had given the Zanussi shoe polish, saying, "Oh, that's a medicine, rub it all over yourself." So they probably found that hilariously funny, but it was just a sign of a contempt with which they treated the Zanussi. But of course, that rebounded on them. One thing, by the way, that the Italians would do, they would sometimes take, if they wanted information from the Zanussi about the British and the Zanussi wouldn't give it, they would take the headman and then put him in an aeroplane and fly over at low level over their village and throw the headman out, and so that it would obviously land dead on the middle of a village as a warning. So they committed crimes against humanity, but it rebounded on them because the Zanussi were played a very important part in. So this chap Lofty Carr, he was the first navigator, the chief navigator of Y Patrol, and he was Bagnold's driver, and he would drive Bagnold out into a meeting point into the desert with various Zanussi headmen. He would bring with him tea. They loved tea. And in exchange, they would give and proper medicine. And in exchange, they would give him all the information that they gathered on Italians as they'd just been traveling around the desert. So it was they worked very well. But that was, I think, passed on. Lawrence had a great respect for the Arabs, and also I think a great, a very very perceptive, and saw that there was a tendency, obviously, in this time to look on anyone as who wasn't white as sort of heathen, instead of understanding that they had much to teach the European. And T.E. Lawrence understood that, and Bagnold understood that, and the Germans and the Italians never did.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating. That's a whole podcast in and of itself. Every time you come on, it's like, right, we need to get him on again. So for sort of for the nerds, let's delve into how the Long Range Desert Group were then formed into sort of what I would describe as self-contained battleships almost.
Yeah, it's a good way of putting it. Yeah.
So
Yeah, which is actually a very good phrase there because when Bagnold sold the idea to Wavell, he said piracy on the high sea, on the sand seas.
oh, well,
And so there was and of course, in a way it is. I mean, the desert, that's what, that the both the LRDG and the SAS veterans told me that what the most enjoyable might be the wrong word, but what the great difference between the desert and European theatres, be it Sicily, Italy, France, or wherever, was that there were no civilians to get in the way in the desert. In a way, and so it was a bit like an ocean. And
right,
particularly in the desert, you were trying to sort of outflank the enemy and hit him from the rear. And so it was. And there was, of course, no Gestapo, no Nazis. So it was a clean war, a chivalrous war. I think it's a bit of a cliche to say that about the war in North Africa, but in general, and certainly there were no captured. That chap I talked about, mentioned earlier, Lofty Carr, he was actually captured in 1940, September 1942, as were a couple of the SAS veterans I spoke to, and they were taken off and spent the rest of the war in PLW camps, whereas the majority of SAS and SBS captured from 43 onwards in Europe were executed.
right. I see. And yeah, and so each sort of truck had on it what would become this self-contained battleship would be you'd have like a medic and a navigator and an engineer, and so were they sort of I don't know, they're operating in a unit, but they were just sort of these sort of self-contained vessels as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Normally, each patrol would be 5 vehicles,
Right.
and they would have a bit like sort of Scott of the Antarctica exploration in the early 20th century. They would lay depots, so depots of petrol and water under cairns and obviously mark them on the map so that there was always a supply if they did run out. Um, then in 1941, they did actually apply to the RAF for two light aircraft, but the RAF wouldn't give them any, so they purchased two American biplanes, and which were vital for evacuating badly wounded from hundreds of miles. So their Oasis, because of the sort of the to and fro nature of a desert war in particularly in 1942, their bases changed a bit. Kufra was one. Kufra was Siwa Oasis, Kufra Oasis. So they were they weren't just sort of a couple of palm trees and a pool. They were towns. Towns were built there, and they were cafes, and I mean, it wasn't the height of sophistication, but there was civilization there, and they constructed airstrips, and they were of great strategic importance in the Desert War. Jalo was another one, and but these two aeroplanes allowed, firstly, evacuating the very badly wounded, bringing in supplies where necessary, and also bringing in messages. So that was a great way of communicating too for the LRDG. But as you said, it was fundamentally these sort of self-contained um, battleships, and they were just experts in navigation, and they had a signals unit too. He thought of everything, Bagnold, and I think this is why there was a lack of respect between the long range desert group hierarchy and fundamentally David Sterling. It wasn't so much Paddy Mayne, it was David Sterling, because he was just lazy, and he expected the long range desert group to do his logistics for him. So the LRDG set up a signaling section, and they were signaling also for the SAS. And David Sterling did none of this. And when he wanted a navigator, the LRDG gave him Mike Sadler. So Mike Sadler, who was in Rogue Heroes and who is better known today. Mike Sadler died in January last year, the last of of the sort of the big desert veterans, if I can put it like that. As though he's more associated with the SAS, he began in the Long Range Desert Group, and it was Mike who, after the first disastrous SAS raid when they went in by parachute in the night of November the 16th, 1941, and of the 55 men who dropped, 34 were killed or captured. So that's when we mentioned at the top of the show the SAS would have died but for the LRDG. And it was the LRDG who said, look, we can transport you to the targets in the back of our Chevrolets, and we'll drop you. You go in and then rendezvous, and we'll take you back. And it was Mike Sadler who took Paddy Mayne and his raiding party to Tamet Airfield on early December 41, where they destroyed a mess full of German aircrew and 24 aircraft. And that was the beginning of Mike's um, relation, his first uh, encounter with the SAS, and I think partly probably to get rid of David Stirling and to give them some self-sufficiency, because Guy Prendergast, who replaced Bagnold as CO, he described that he, in one cable to GHQ, he said, listen, we're fed up with playing universal aunt to all these disparate groups, Popsky's Private Army, um, some secret agents who were being deposited in the desert, but most of all the SAS. And so giving them a navigator, Mike Sadler, was one way of making them stand on their own 2 feet. And then in the summer of 42, they got their own jeeps. And so that was really I suppose, the beginning of it was the beginning of the end of their working relationship. And though they did collaborate in a couple of raids in September 1942, namely against at Benghazi. From the summer of 42, the SAS became independent, to the relief of the Long Range Desert Group, who were just getting a little bit fed up with David Stirling's lackadaisical approach.
That's it. Actually, I wanted to talk about that a bit further then. But before I do, because I think this is really interesting as well. Their battleships, as we decided to call them, they were painted with certain decorations as well. Can you talk
They
a
were
little?
painted pink. They were, which the SAS did in the Iraq War. There's the Pink Panthers, I think they're called, their Jeeps, their Land Rovers, because at in the early morning, evening, the reflection of the sun, um, it was pink. Pink vehicles were found, particularly they were not completely pink. They were a mix of pink and yellow, and blue, light blue, but to blend in with the lights of the created by the sun. And it made them very hard to spot from aircraft from above, because that was the great fear. The great fear wasn't meeting another, because the Germans didn't. I spoke to one Afrika Korps veteran who was actually Rommel's driver, a chap called Rudolf Schneider, who was in something called Kampfstaffel, which was the elite unit of the Afrika Korps. Um, and I asked him, why didn't the Afrika Korps come up with an equivalent? And he said, well, it was, we were scared of the desert. We kept to the coastal roads. We didn't like going into the interior of the desert. We didn't know it. And so whereas I said earlier, the Long Range Desert Group, they never feared it. They respected it, but they didn't fear it. And a bit like the jungle fighting, if you're taught to respect the jungle, but not to be afraid of it. Um, and um, and so because of that, the fear of the LRDG was aerial attack, because if you're caught in the open, you're buggered, for want of a better word. And so, but you could see an aircraft coming from some distance, and even if you just stop, it's very hard for an aircraft to spot you on the desert. But if you camouflaged your aircraft, and if you've got time to put some netting over it, it's very hard to be seen. So there were only, I think, very few cases of SAS soldiers, of LRDG soldiers being killed. One of the rare examples was after one of those SAS raids in December 1941, when in fact it was friendly fire and it was an RAF plane,
Right.
and it killed two LRDG men. And but it was on the whole, that wasn't a problem really for the LRDG, but it was always lurking there in the back of the mind. But again, it was, as we said earlier, it's just one of the innovations of Bagnold, and that invaluable experience that he'd gained in the 20s and 30s, about not just the desert terrain, but how to harness it to your own advantage, and just the knowledge of that gave him and the long range desert group an edge over the enemy. And interestingly, in fact, I tweeted about this today, just a little tweet. The only time the Germans did come up with something was a comparable unit. It was Count Laszlo uh, Almasi, who was the inspiration for The English Patient, the film,
Oh yeah,
uh,
yeah.
where, what, 25 years ago, I think, a
Right.
book first and then a film, which was fictionalized. But he was a Hungarian aristocrat who knew Bagnold before the war, and because they'd explored, I think they explored once together, and he was a member of the Zazura Club, which was a club founded in 1930 by Bagnold for desert explorers. And in May 1942, he led a team of 8 Germans on a reconnaissance mission. And he wrote in his diary, no initiative. I have to keep asking and ordering everything. They did gather some intelligence, but when he passed it on to Rommel, Rommel ignored it and said, "No, no, I'll do things my own way." And after the war, Almasi and Bagnold met again, and Almasi told Bagnold of this one attempt to form an LRDG in the Axis army. And Bagnold said it throws a curious light on Rommel's attitude. Poor Almasi, with his knowledge of the interior of a desert, he must have longed to do what my people were doing. But Rommel was no Wavell, and he was kept on a tight rein. So it's fascinating, I think, that, because we think, Rommel, the desert fox, this master of strategy, and but in fact he was rather set in his ways, and he was a great sort of on the bigger picture, but he just didn't have that mind of, well, as Bagnall said, of Wavell. But Wavell, of course, knew, as I said, knew T. Lawrence, and just, I think there was the the British have always had, I think, partly being an island race, um, needed to improvise and innovate. And that goes back to sort of, I suppose, the Buccaneers and the in Elizabethan times, and it was something that was then taken on, and it really reached its zenith in the Second World War, when the type of warfare, if you compare it to the dreadful attrition and the static warfare of the First World War, didn't really allow any opportunity for innovation and initiative, whereas the Second World War, and particularly with the advances in technology, communications, transport in the interwar years, really was which is why there were so many of these private armies, as they were nicknamed. But it was just, there's never been a war like it, I think, for allowing one's initiative to flourish.
You raise a very interesting point about Rommel and then the Germans as well. And then, correct me if I'm wrong, this is sort of what I've read about the SAS finding the Germans to be somewhat vainglorious and therefore quite easy to outfox.
Yeah,
Whereas
yeah.
the Italians, who were the sons of Machiavelli, were a bit more tricky to deal with because they were a bit more suspicious. I believe, just doing a little bit of research as well, that the Italians did have their own sort of version of the long range desert group, which is sort of
Yeah,
horridly named Sahariania or something.
that's right. Yeah, that's right. They did, but it was never as uh it was never as big, it was never as well organized, and it just didn't they were of course demoralized quite quickly in the war, and again it never really had the opportunity to it just wasn't about. I mean, it's a good expression there that Bagnold said he was kept on a tight rein, and even that the Auto-Saharan company was kept on quite a tight rein, whereas the long range desert group wasn't. It was just let off the leash, and it really could do. Bagnold was he worked closely with Wavell, and then Auchinleck, who replaced him, who gave the green light to the SAS. Um, then they were quite lucky there. David Sterling, after the war, criticised that his expression was layers of fossilized shit for staff officers within Middle East HQ. And there were undoubtedly at sort of middle management level a lot of those rather unimaginative staff officers. But in Wavell and Auchinleck and Arthur Smith and Neil Ritchie, who were the senior officers, I think they really saw very quickly, understood how the long range desert group, these private armies, these um, guerrilla units could benefit them, and they did give them a free rein, and that was so. I mean, that was seen really after that first SAS raid, which was a debacle. That they the LRDG took the SAS under their wing, and GHQ, yeah, didn't interfere. It trusted Bagnold and trusted Prendergast, and so I think that's why they were so effective. They were given yeah, they were trusted. They were given a degree of responsibility. And as I said, it was important that, and that, that in defense of David Sterling, um, he was a young man. He was 25. The long range desert group officers were middle aged. They had a lot of experience. Some of them had fought in the First World War, so they knew what they were doing, and they were just more experienced in war and in life, and that showed in the effectiveness of the long range desert group, what it accomplished, and in comparison, I think, to the SAS, which really only began to evolve into an effective regiment in Sicily and Italy. So after the desert, in the desert, it was still a little bit. It was learning the ropes.
Yeah, and I'm going to come back to Sicily in a second because I'm actually going to do a tour there later on this year. But just sort of round out the long range desert group. Once the auntie had been freed from her responsibilities, and the split with the SAS, and they got Mike Sadler and everybody, and they can go on their own 2 feet. What was then the role of the long range desert group after that? Did they sort of go off back doing reconnaissance work, doing road patrol?
Yeah, I mean, it's important to say that the long range desert group did a lot of raiding too, in particularly in 1941 before the SAS came along. In fact, they pioneered at a raid on an Italian fort 1,000 miles west of Cairo, Merzuk. They pioneered the driving on to the airfield in a heavily armed vehicle. When opening fire, they destroyed 3 aircraft, a great deal of fuel, took 20 prisoners. This is in January 1941. We tend to think that it was the SAS in their jeeps in the summer of 42 who pioneered that tactic, but it was a long-range desert group. And that's I mean, the long range desert group weren't hostile to the formation of the SAS. They saw that it could complement them and also free them up. Their raison d'etre was intelligence gathering, and this was done particularly in road watches. So
Yeah,
road watches, which were often done 500 miles or more behind enemy lines, and as this chap Lofty Carr told me, that's actually safer place to be than 50 miles behind enemy lines, because there the enemy are jumpy, because they know that the enemy is near. But if you're 500 miles behind enemy lines, everyone's relaxed. They're
Yeah.
not going to get us here. Um, and they did these road watches. Now, these are particularly important around before and after the Alamein offensive in October 1942. And these would involve a patrol going off and then um, making camp a few miles from a coastal road, and then in pairs they would be 24-hour shifts. They would go off to a vantage point overlooking the coastal road, and they would one would with the binoculars just look at all the traffic, and as he was looking, he would say what he was seeing, and it would be noted down in a notebook by his buddy, and then they would return back to the camp after 24 hours, and it would be radioed back to LRDG HQ. Now, these were amazingly detailed reports, not only the type of vehicle, but the state of the men, whether if they were going to the front or returning, were they singing songs, did they look dejected? um, the um, the number of vehicles, the size of vehicles, what they were carrying, the armament, if they were tanks, whatever. So all this that enabled the GHQ to build a picture of the enemy, and then later on, when the Germans were in the Axis forces were in full retreat. In January 1943, they played this was the New Zealand patrol under a great officer called Nick Wilder, blazed a trail into Tunisia, what was known as the left hook. So they to outflank the Germans, which Montgomery then used when he launched his big assault into Tunisia. And he wrote to Prendergast beginning of April 43 when the Desert War was effectively over, just to say how much he appreciated the invaluable work of a long range desert group, particularly in pioneering this route round the Axis defensive line, the Marath line, but this left hook. So they were absolutely vital. That's in a way, actually, it's interesting because they were very effective in the first year up until about really that year 1942, particularly the 6 months when they were playing universal aunt to the LR to the SAS. It sort of restricted what they could do because a lot of the time they were going out either dropping the SAS at targets and then picking them up, or sometimes having to go and pick up stranded SAS. And as I said, it wasn't just the SAS, it was other groups too. And so I think this was contributed to this feeling of resentment that they were wasting too much. They could be spending their time more effectively, and that showed, I think, when the SAS became self-sufficient, got their jeeps, then in September 42 became a regiment, and really that was a moment where the LRDG and the SAS parted ways, and the LRDG in those last 6 months, 7 months of a war were probably at their most effective.
Um, that's brilliant. I think we've almost done an hour again. You're gonna have to come on again. What I found out was two things then. Two more questions for you. One, why were they denied deployment to the Far East? Well, answer that first because the next question doesn't really follow on.
Why were they?
Denied deployment to the Far East.
Oh, just because of the two bombs dropped, the
Oh,
atomic bombs. That
timing.
the word went out in beginning of 1945. Same in the SAS and the SBS, who would be willing to redeploy volunteers for the Far East. There were uh, about 200 for the LRGG, which is more well about which was about two-thirds of their fighting strength, so a really good response. And and then they were so this was June 45 because they were in Italy when the war ended. and they began to return to the UK end of May, beginning of June 1945 to begin to prepare. But of course, beginning of August, the bombs dropped, and so that uh, meant that they had no need for them. And I mean, it's an interesting period because July 1945, the patron of British Special Forces, if you like, was Winston Churchill, and he was swept out of power in the July 45 general election when the British public decided great war leader, but now we needed a new government for a new era of peace. So it was Clement Attlee, the Labour government, and undoubtedly there'd been among some politicians, Tory and Labour, there'd been a degree of unease at special forces, renegades, cutthroats, etc., mavericks. Wasn't the sort of British way, but I think it was essentially a belief, or certainly a need to believe, that after this cataclysmic war, um, we were now going to embark on a new golden era of peace, and the fewer soldiers we would have, the better. So they disbanded the SAS, SBS, Long Range Desert Group. And as I mentioned earlier, the SAS was um, raised as a territorial unit in 47, and then as a regular unit deployed to Malaya in 52, because of course then what no one saw was how quickly the British Empire would break up, whether it was in Oman, Aden, Malaya, um, uh, Kenya, and other places. And in fact, there was a need for such a force. But when 22 SAS was raised in 1952, they drew very heavily on the experience not just of a wartime SAS, but the SBS and the Long Range Desert Group, in particularly in determining what qualities of recruit they wanted. So what made the best special forces recruit? Because of course it was going to be very similar. The sort of warfare, the sort of fighting of the of 22 SAS was going to, if anything, be a little bit more like the LRDG than the SAS in World War II. So the LRDG contributed very much to the formation and the ethos of 22 SAS, but just didn't contribute the name.
You quite brilliantly almost answered in a perfect segue question. So I'll have a look at it. I'm not sure whether I'll ask it. Yes, hang on, let me have a look at it. Because the SAS, or its new incarnation, it had an LRDG element called a mobility troop. Is that right?
I think so, yeah. Yeah, I don't really follow the modern SAS, but I think it does, yeah.
But we should just round out and say that they were an integral part of the newly formed SAS. I think that's an absolutely perfect way to end, Gavin. It's been fantastic again, mate. We've done an hour and it just seems like 5 minutes, and I've still got 2 pages of questions. You're going to have to come up with a trilogy.
No, I mean, I'd love to. It's a great topic because it's fascinating to see too that the long range desert group for the wartime generation,
Yeah,
civilians and soldiers, the long range desert group was the number one, and it was much more famous post-war in the 50s and 60s. And there's a film of Dickie Attenborough, um, Sea of Sands.
yeah.
Hollywood did this Rat Patrol, this sort of um, weekly, like not a soap opera, but a weekly drama, which is loosely based on the Long Range Desert Group. And then what came along, 1980, the embassy siege,
Yeah.
SAS abseiling down, and suddenly so began the cult of the SAS. And the Long Range Desert Group, slowly as that generation began to die out, began to sort of lose um, yeah, just lose its eminence, I suppose. And now only military, which is why I'm delighted to be talking tonight, only military history buffs are aware of a long range desert group. And it's so it was good. Yeah, it was good in the first series of Rogue Heroes. I was glad that they name checked the long range desert group, and I thought they did quite well at capturing their sort of just cool maverick, yeah, chilled out
I think
demeanor.
it as well. It was really good, really good. Well, listen, Gavin, I'll let you go. It's been fantastic once again.
Thank you very
I'll
much.
do a trilogy, mate. I've got to get you back. I've got a whole
Yeah,
bunch.
anytime. Good to talk to you, and yeah, go well and speak to you soon.
Cheers, Gav. Thanks very much.
Bye.
Cheers, mate. Bye. Well, that was Gavin Mortimer, and another fantastic hour, and I managed to keep it almost solely on the long range desert group, which you know what, I had a whole bunch more questions which I didn't ask because I can only keep the nice man for an hour. Anyway, thank you so much for listening. Thanks for everybody. Hopefully, Dougie will be back when we're back next week. I know Leighton has lined up a whole bunch of really cool guests to follow on from Gavin, who is super cool as well. Thank you to everybody for listening, and thank you to our patrons who continue to give us the support so we can carry on, keep the lights on at the podcast. Thank you so much, and I'll catch you next week.